Hi, this is Rabbi Sandy Zisser. Welcome back to Jews and the History of Messianism. This is Unit 5, Shabbatai Zvi. So I will be honest, Shabbatai Zvi is one of my favorite, if not my favorite, false messiah. Now, I know what you're thinking, how do you have a favorite false messiah? But it turns out that Shabbatai Zvi was the actually single false messiah that I learned about growing up. Never heard of any of the other ones before I was an adult. Shabbatai Zvi was the false messiah that was taught in after-school Hebrew schools. He was taught in the yeshiva that I attended. He was the quintessential false messiah. So, as false messiahs go, Shabbatai Zvi actually did a really, really good job. According to record, over 1 million Jews believed that he was actually the Messiah. And at the high point of his career as a false Messiah, or I should say, career trying to convince people that he was the Messiah, more than 50%, it says, of the world jury believed that he actually was the Messiah, the Mashiach. And we're talking about not thousands of years ago, we're talking about 1665. So let's take a look at who Shabbatai Zvi was, where he came from, what he did, and obviously his ultimate downfall. So, Shabbatai Zvi is born in Izmir, Turkey, on the 9th of Av in 1626. Now, just this one piece of information gave people this idea that yes, he clearly is the Mashiach, because being born on the 9th of Av, it's triple tragedy, right? First temple destroyed in 586 BCE, the second temple destroyed in 70 CE, the end of the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 CE, all happened on the 9th of Av. So the concept that the birth date of the Mashiach would be the 9th of Av could be very high, right? And the fact is that if Shabbatai Zvi's birth was actually the 9th of Av, we also know that the 9th of Av in 1626, when Shabbatai Zvi was born, was a Saturday. How do we know that? Because his parents clearly followed the local custom of naming their child after the day they were born on. The Sabbath, Shabbatai Zvi. Okay. Interestingly enough, we know a lot about Shabbatai Zvi and his family because of the year. The year was 1626. We know we have records from that period of time. So it seems like Shabbatai Zvi and his parents were Ashkenazi Jews. And that we also know from records that Shabbatai Zvi received a rabbinic education and studied Torah and Talmud and Kabbalah and other Jewish texts. And he actually had some major issues. He had actually a recorded mental breakdown during his early teenhood, which actually causes him to withdraw from his education around the age of 15, and he actually immerses himself in solitary Kabbalistic study. And one of the things that scholars and theologians have surmised from Shabbatai Zvi is that he probably had some form of bipolar disorder, which led to this mental breakdown. And that also will give us reason for many of the pieces that we see about Shabbatai Zvi along his life. But what he does is, because of his mental breakdown and the apparent bipolar disorder he has, he also struggles apparently with uncontrolled sexual urges throughout his lifetime. And he has to deal with all of that. So after he starts studying Kabbalah, really, really full time, he actually begins about 5 or 6 years into his study to develop a group of followers who studied Kabbalah under him. You study long enough and then you become the master, right? And when he was 21, he actually has another full mental episode, according to record. And one of the things that occur for him is that the beginning of this mental breakdown for him was that he began using the unpronounceable name of God and pronouncing it. So the unpronounceable name of God, the Yud He Vav He name of God, is unpronounceable because all of the letters, the Yud, the He, the Vav, and the He, are all vowel sounds. And because of that, they are not pronounceable without vowels. And because the Torah has no vowels, we don't exactly know what the pronunciation is. But Shabbatai Zvi acted on it and actually pronounced the unpronounceable name of God. Now, Jewish law, rabbinic authority, forbid the pronunciation of God's name because we don't actually know the name of God and how to pronounce it. You could actually be taking God's name in vain, breaking one of the commandments by mispronouncing God's name. So all of the words we have for God are actually adjectives that actually describe God. Even the word God is not the word for God, right? But Shabbatai Zvi actually begins to use God's name in public. And he actually defies all of the decrees and customs associated with not doing that. And he actually begins to proclaim to be the Messiah. He made other claims that proved his power as the Messiah. He claimed to be able to levitate. He also told his followers that they were not allowed to see him do that because they weren't pure enough. And his followers noticed that he also had a sweet smell to him. But he did say that the patriarchs, Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, visited him and anointed him with oil. And he changes the story later when he retells it in the documents that we have, that it was actually not the patriarchs, but actually Elijah that visited him to do this anointment of oil. Now, of course, it's important, the anointment of oil idea, because the Mashiach would be anointed. And all of his followers follow his decrees and break the rules with him or modify the rules with him. So for a normal Jew living in Turkey at the time, Shabbatai Zvi is acting very strange, right? And perhaps almost like a madman. But the rabbis of Turkey see Shabbatai Zvi as a threat. And in 1651, they excommunicate him and they banish him from the community. And the reason for this, of course, is that the rabbis are seeing the world jury at the time, or the jury in Turkey at the time, being overwhelmed by the excitement of actually having the Mashiach show up. And they know from history what has happened before. But the time period does seem ripe for some sort of messianic era to come about, because there is unprecedented suffering in the 1640s in different Jewish populations and Jewish communities across Europe that would herald in the bringing of the Messiah. You have anti-Semitic riots in all of the cities that are heavily Jewish populations. You had pogroms and riots in Poland in 1648. And it seemed very much so to those people who were suffering that God would surely stop their suffering by sending the Messiah and bringing in the Messianic era. So Jews in Europe in 1648 were ripe for the Messiah, and they needed that. And Shabbatai Zvi rose to the occasion for this. So it didn't happen overnight. It would take another 15 or so years for Shabbatai Zvi to travel and get his word out before he actually before the world jury could see him as the actual Messiah. But after his excommunication by the rabbis, he wanders. He wanders from Turkey and to Greece and stops in Salonika, where he actually calls out the rabbis of this town and stands in front of the Salonika synagogue under a chuppah, a traditional wedding canopy, with a Torah, and asserts that he is now married to the Torah. The rabbis of Salonika are outraged and they banish him from there. And after that, by 1658, 1660, he travels to Constantinople and to Cairo. And while he's doing that, he is going through manic depressive moments and having these bipolar moments. And he is going between depression and normalcy and acts of rage and acts of love. And he does at that time declare the coming of the Messianic era. And he celebrated the 3 annual pilgrimage festivals, Pesach, Sukkot, and Shavuot, all in 1 week. He dressed a large fish in baby clothes and displayed it in the carriage, announcing the beginning of the Messianic era. I mean, things that are quite odd, right? But we have records of all of this. And he proclaimed that God now permitted everything. In 1662, we know from records he moves to Jerusalem, where he settles in and secludes himself and studies and fasts in solitude. And for a little while, he does manage a very low profile in Jerusalem. But that's about to change, because in 1665, while living in Jerusalem, he comes across a person, Abraham Natan ben Elisha Chaim Ashkenazi, right, who was better known as Natan of Gaza. And because Shabbatai Zvi is reclusive at this moment, he's living a low existence, right, a non-in-the-camera existence from the Jewish people. He finds Natan, and it changes. There's a moment of change for him here, because Natan has dreams of his own, and he actually believes that Shabbatai Zvi is the Messiah, based on his dreams. So it took about a week's worth of travel time that Natan was convinced that Shabbatai Zvi is the Messiah. And from that point on, Natan of Gaza became basically the scribe for Shabbatai Zvi, recording everything that he did. And that's where we have the majority of our historical documents from. Right? So he becomes his Shabbatai Zvi's personal secretary, basically. And as partnerships go, this is a superstar partnership, for better or for worse. And officially, on Shavuot in 1665, Shabbatai Zvi declares that he is the Messiah, that he is the Mashiach. And the amazing part is how fast this news spreads throughout Palestine and the rest of the Jewish world. And Judaism from this point on is changed forever. And what always amazed me about this part of the story is how much an entire Jewish population, basically a worldwide Jewish population, could be overcome by the thought of Shabbatai Zvi being the Messiah. The world Jewry suffered so much to this point that the concept that this was going to happen overtook everything. And it's my belief that's how Shabbatai Zvi was able to be so popular as the Messiah. So originally, if you remember, when we first spoke about Shabbatai Zvi's miracles, that he claimed to be able to levitate, but no one could see him do it, right? And very soon after he was pronounced as the Messiah, his followers expected miracles, and he didn't disappoint. He actually showed miracles throughout, or supposedly showed miracles throughout the region. And some of the miracles that he performed, or said to have performed, was that he correctly predicts the death of certain individuals that weren't sick. He correctly predicts eclipses and hailstorms. He had a fire set in the public square and walked through it several times. And of course, these are all told by, now, obviously, no one's actually witnessing these. These are all told by Natan or by Shabbatai to the community. But then something happens very interestingly, and we have record of this. The Jews in Aleppo, in Syria, declare that Elijah has actually been spotted in Aleppo, in the Aleppo synagogue, and magically filled the charity box. Now, soon after that story circulates, there are more Elijah sightings around the globe, which is amazing about how that caught fire. What's interesting is that the Jews of Aleppo kept meticulous record that also showed this as an occurrence at the time. So it's being propagated across the region that Shabbatai Zvi is actually the Mashiach. And what happens is that local rabbis feel powerless to resist the concept that Shabbatai Zvi is not the Mashiach. And Shabbatai Zvi actually becomes the center of the religious authority in certain areas and in 1665, the fever pitch of Shabbatai Zvi being the Messiah hits a high point, because according to biblical sources, when the Mashiach comes, people, ordinary people not related to the Mashiach, would be able to prophesy. And all of a sudden, mass prophecies break out in the region, in Aleppo, in Damascus, in Sfat. And it's being reported across the region that these things are happening, that it's reported by religious leaders and travelers and government officials. And in fact, it was December 12th of 1665. Shabbatai Zvi goes to the Portuguese synagogue, the center of the remaining opposition in the city, and breaks in and declares that the congregation is exempt from the obligations of prayer and pronounced the name of God. And Shabbatai concludes this bizarre service that he then holds with a Torah scroll in his arms. Shortly after, he decrees that the redemption will be on the 15th day of the month of Sivan, and which is June 18th of 1666. And the amazing part of that is that the reaction from the world Jewry was tremendous. It was at the time estimated that about 1 million Jews believed that he was actually the Messiah, which is about another fascinating aspect of Shabbatai Zvi, is that his movement that he creates goes across borders, it goes across continents, it goes across social classes and religious cultural heritage. This was truly a global movement. He has followers in England, in France, Holland, Central Europe, the Balkans, Poland, Russia, Egypt, Turkey, Palestine, across the globe. And synagogue services throughout the world were changed to include specific prayers for Shabbatai Zvi at this time, who was the Messianic king. And even there were publishers that printed new Sidurim, new prayer books written by Natan of Gaza, featuring a picture of their new Messiah. In many Jewish communities across the globe, Jews held celebrations in honor of the Mashiach's coming, arrival, and that redemption was expected so soon that Jews no longer had to concern themselves with worldly possessions, and they started giving up positions of power. They stopped working. They gave up their wealth in desire for the redemption. And then in 1666, the frenzy of the world comes to a point, and Shabbatai Zvi begins the restoration immediately, and he doesn't disappoint them. There's word that goes out to the Jewish communities globally that Shabbatai Zvi was on the move, and his first step to become the Messianic king in Jerusalem was the logic one, and that's where he goes. And it was announced that Shabbatai Zvi had set out for Constantinople to receive the Sultan's crown of dominion over Palestine and all of the other lands that Turkey owned. Now, there were also stories circulating of the 10 lost tribes already on the move to go back to Israel or to Palestine. And Natan predicts that Shabbatai Zvi would go seize the crown from the Sultan with the help of God, not an army, and then begin the redemption. But as all good things go, they don't always turn out the way they should. So the end was actually a shameful disaster for Shabbatai Zvi. And in fact, his followers could not envision such a horrible ending. Because what happens is, as Shabbatai Zvi sailed into Constantinople, the Sultan's Grand Vizier stopped the ship at sea and arrested Shabbatai Zvi. So he's actually imprisoned in Constantinople and is then moved to a fortress and becomes one of a very weird imprisonment indeed. Because what happens is he's given a place in prison to actually conduct business, and had a pretty comfortable prison stay. So while in prison, Shabbatai Zvi and Natan continue to issue proclamations of their theological changes that should occur for the Jewish community throughout the world to bring on the Messianic age. From prison, Shabbatai Zvi and Natan declare that many of the old restrictions of the Torah are no longer applicable, and Shabbatai Zvi abolishes the laws concerning sexual relations, kashrut, and even fasting on the 9th of Av. He also declares that the biblical views of work on Shabbat are permitted. He then declares that the redemption would begin in the next Jewish year of 5427, which would start in September of 1666. Now, ironically, he almost got that correct, because at that time, a Rabbi Nehemiah Cohen, had been traveling around Poland making strange prophecies and declarations. Now, this Rabbi Nehemiah Cohen, could have been seen as crazy, but Shabbatai Zvi can't actually ignore him. Nehemiah claimed that he was the Messiah of the house of Joseph. Now, if you remember going back to what that means, is that there was a tradition that there be two Messiahs that show up. One, the war Messiah, the one that brings about the ultimate destruction of evil, and the second Messiah, the house of David Messiah, would be the one that heralds in the redemption. So now all of a sudden, you have Shabbatai Zvi having to deal with a prophet stepping on his territory, right? And what's interesting is that if Nehemiah hadn't finished his obligation as the Messiah of Joseph, then the redemption that Shabbatai Zvi was promising could never happen because the first one hadn't finished yet. And then a very weird piece happens based on our documentation that Rabbi Nehemiah goes to the prison where Shabbatai Zvi is being held, and the two debate Kabbalah for 3 days. And neither one actually wins this, but eventually Rabbi Nehemiah declares to the Sultan that Shabbatai Zvi is a fraud and that Nehemiah actually converts to Islam as a sign of reliability. And because of that, Shabbatai Zvi is removed from his cushy prison, taken to another prison that's a bit more harsh. And at this moment, his followers believe that this was the ploy, that this was a ploy from Shabbatai Zvi to actually seize power and receive the Sultan's crown. But instead, as he was moved, Shabbatai Zvi was given a choice. Either he was going to suffer unimaginable torture and death eventually, or he can have to convert to Islam. And Shabbatai Zvi, as history notes, converts to Islam. So all of a sudden, we have the Messiah, who had more than 50% of world Jewry believing that he was the Messiah, converting to Islam. Shabbatai Zvi's followers are dismayed. They don't know what to make of this. Of course, this also catches Natan off guard as well. So he tries to scramble and fix this as best he can and sets up a new timetable for the actual redemption. And of course, that never works out. It wasn't enough to hold the movement, this excitement for the Mashiach together. So the ultimate end for Shabbatai Zvi is he dies at the age of 50 on September 17th, 1676, which also happened to be Yom Kippur, 5437, exactly 10 years after he begins. I hope you enjoyed. We'll see you next.